coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
If you don't offer support and quote unquote gender affirming care, which is, as you said, often a euphemism for the beginning stages of sterilization through puberty blockers and then a stepping stone to mutilating surgeries, permanently removing body parts gendered body parts. Unless you do all this, you're going to have a bunch of dead kids on your hand because they have bad mental health, et cetera, et cetera. Leaving aside the fact completely that there doesn't really seem to be any evidence of that yet. And I would actually submit, even if there were evidence of that, the solution wouldn't be to mutilate people and block their hormones. But anyway, this is how the fight's playing out. So it will take, I think, many years now before, we'll see how this clash plays out, and we'll see how the business community and how the kind of Chamber of Commerce type donor community on the right responds to this type of thing. So a lot of this will have to be led, I think, culturally and politically from the bottom up, and we're seeing this too, by the revolt of the moms at school board meetings and running for local office, running for local school board and all this stuff. And then the top down thing to solve is both at the state level, I think, there are lots of creative ways to come at this, and then also at the national legislative level or regulatory level, is you really must dismantle, figuratively burn to the ground, and salt the earth all of the education schools in the country.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind, and I am joined today, the schedule giveth and the schedule taketh away. I'm joined today by only one stalwart friend and boss. That is Ryan Williams, our publisher and president. Ryan, it's just you and me. Here we go. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Spencer. And
of course,
we'll make the best of this. Laverne and Shirley? No, that's a terrible no. Abbott and Costello? No. We'll stop.
What's the ones? Who are the ones that drive off the cliff at the end?
That's Thelma and Louise.
Thelma and Louise.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. So of course our buddy references have gotten more suspect as we've moved along. So, okay, we'll stop.
Starsky and Hutch. There we go. That's a good one.
much more masculine, yeah.
That's right. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The name Butch is in the title. Okay. Well, we've got actually lots of things to talk about, so we won't lack for subject matter, even if we lack for comrades, our friends. Seth Barron's out for Yom Kippur. James Boulos is scheming to save the world from the bots through his conference that he's running. And so here we are, holding down the fort. Now, first and foremost, before anything else, Ryan, I have a bone to pick with you. And that is that on the American Mind Slack, which I'm now going to put on blast, I'm just reading here from your direct quote, "Would all your base belong to us be too esoteric a podcast title?" Did you forget who you were talking to here? I don't know if all your base or belong to us is like obscure for brain dead Zoomers or something, but come on, man, everybody's got to know all your base or belong to us. It's internet canon. It's part of. I know I've probably insulted half our listenership who don't know what this is.
Yeah.
But
we'll explain it. Yeah.
We will. Yes. No. I kid. Of course, all your base or belong to us. This is. For a certain generation of internet users, this is a very famous mistranslation from the video game Zero Wing, which was a side scroller in, I believe, Nintendo. I think that was a Nintendo. Do you know, Ryan? Was it Nintendo, Super Nintendo that put this out?
I don't remember.
Okay. Well, anyway, it was a very bad. This was not the only mistranslation, though it was the most famous. In Zero Wing, you have to fight against the alien android Cats, C-A-T-S, and Cats has taken all of your bases. Sort of the original Japanese here, which I looked up for the purposes of this podcast, but it was somehow mangled into all your base belong to us. And there is a point to this. I am not just indulging in sort of.
It was a Sega game.
It was Sega.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So I guess my lore knowledge is not.
I did go on to Nintendo too, I think.
Okay, let's see here. I'll find it. Namco, published by Namco.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, You can't play it on a PlayStation 5. That's all I know.
Yeah.
But this, I guess, was the early 2000s sort of internet lore, and you were in fact raising it because of this little quote from the World Economic Forum. This is Melissa Flemings of the United Nations, and she says I don't know if this is saying the quiet part out loud or if they're just coming right out and saying this now. This is Melissa Fleming. We own the science on climate change. Let's listen to this clip.
We partnered with Google, for example. If you Google climate change, you will, at the top of your search, you will get all kinds of UN resources. We started this partnership when we were shocked to see that when we Googled climate change, we were getting incredibly distorted information right at the top. So we're becoming much more proactive. We own the science, and we think that the world should know it, and the platforms themselves also do. But again, it's a huge challenge that I think all sectors of society need to be very active in.
So this seemed worth talking about to me for a number of reasons. I mean, we've had a couple of these episodes now. We had Jen Psaki mentioning that the White House coordinated with Facebook about which posts were and weren't COVID information that they might like to see either flagged or taken down or suppressed or what have you. And then we had the mission both before Congress and on Rogan from Zuckerberg that the FBI is in contact with big social media platforms about what should and shouldn't get shared, being on the lookout for Russian disinformation, which, as we all know, it's very easy to discern what Russian misinformation is, and there have never been any mistakes made in that regard, and it's always a pristine decision on the part of our philosopher kings. Note that that's a joke, of course. Now, here we have an actual, international official saying that she is worried effectively, not that there might be wrong or false information, but what she actually says is that there's crazy information. The information is either wrongly presented or wrongly framed or not offered. You don't get the results that you want, that she wants you to get when you Google climate change. And so they've worked with Google, and they're very pleased to report that now when you Google climate change, you get, a bunch of UN facts and information, which of course is liable to point you in one particular direction. At the same time, Ryan, you also dropped in the Slack this Breitbart story about Gen Z adults having favorable views, especially about Google and YouTube. This jives with some research I've read too from this firm Handshake, which is kind of a networking firm. And Quartz reported recently on a study that Handshake did about, the Gen Z tends to feel more seen online than in real life, especially after COVID. So the kind of androidification of young people as they grow up without, parental guidance and restraint on this sort of stuff continues apace, and it all kind of starts to meld together into this big digital soup. It's even more apt, I think, to cite this zeroing quotation since it's about an android taking over the world. I mean, this really, Ryan, at this point, starting to sound, of course, we're not dealing in Melissa Fleming with, the American federal government, but we have plenty of, evidence of interaction between the American feds and these companies. This really does, at a certain point, start to seem like not so much a covert or a conspiratorial use of big tech as a sort of unofficial branch of government, but a kind of open melding of government power with tech power in order precisely to shape the narrative, not to find the truth, not to whatever, but to just to nudge people in the direction that our overlords want.
Yeah, the example I would say it's a cross-Atlantic alliance between tech and government to make sure that, look, they're not completely suppressing alternative views, but to make sure that the first, second, and third view that you see have the official imprimatur of the state and the burgeoning world state straddling the Atlantic. It's your example of the precise thing that I sent was that Google and YouTube, which is really, of course, the same company, both under Alphabet, the parent company, are the two top trusted brands for Gen Z, with Netflix being third. And then if you couple that with, so if you think about how people consume information these days online, or how they even actually consume information in the world and look things up, that's one piece of it. And then if you combine it with what you talked about, which is that they feel more seen online, I don't think it would be too hyperbolic to say that we have here what looks to be like both the intellectual and emotional compromising of an entire generation by this unholy alliance between government and big tech. Now, that's a little too overdetermined, as the kids might say, description, but I don't think it's that far off, and it should cause everyone serious concern. And look, if the UN sort of intergovernmental panel on climate change or whatever, their sort of climate change body and scientists and representatives and all the rest, if they were acting actually scientifically, that is to say, presenting hypotheses, sort of testing it against evidence, allowing dissenting views to come in and sort of having a robust debate about this problem, that would be one thing. But they're not doing science. I mean, her saying we own the science is pretty revealing. If any sentiment ever ran counter to the original spirit of the scientific revolution, I think it would probably be that.
Well, we had I am the science, right?
Yes, now that was Fauci, yeah.
The greatest hits of the COVID era, that was Fauci, and now we have we own the science.
I am the science, we own the science, hence my my reference to all your base or belong to us. I thought maybe we might title this one All Your Science Are Belong to Us. No, these are all troubling developments. The big question in my mind is how permeable is this walled garden, to put it in terms that James Polis sometimes talks about on this podcast. That is to say, the original internet, the Wild West of the internet in the 90s was kind of anarchic and libertarian, small L libertarian. It was anyone could share anything online and people could search to their heart's content, and it was basically radically uncensored. And in this Internet 3.0 or 2.0, we have something very different, which is this burgeoning alliance between big tech and government to push official information, to label any other information as misinformation or somehow harmful or corrupting or bad for your health on the trans stuff. It just the ways of them tisking all of it is endless. The new internet is a series of walled gardens. You can search for stuff, but it's hard to really break out. It's not impossible, thank goodness, but it's hard often to get out of this kind of hall of, to mix metaphors, a kind of hall of mirrors of official information, semi-official information, or what looks to be putatively private or, independent, even scientific or academic information, which often has behind it quite a bit of government money and big tech approval. What we do about all that, legislatively and culturally, I think is one of the most interesting questions and most important questions that we need to think through.
Well, it's really in some ways another version of the neutrality fallacy, right? Which is one of the great kind of observations of the new right writ large, is this idea that neutrality is fake, right? And you kind of have these notions of the clean slate public square, the open forum for discourse and debate. And of course, we're in favor, broadly speaking, I should say, at the Claremont Institute of free debate and free discourse, and certainly of unfettered discourse, unfettered by government intervention. But the idea that what that creates is a kind of blank slate always begs the question, or raises the question, I suppose I should say, of who's curating the slate, right? I mean, who is the person deciding what parameters get set? Who sets the Overton window? These things don't just bubble up kind of organically or get imposed by an invisible hand. That people make these choices, which is something that the left is very keen, I think, to illustrate in other areas. They're always about, as James says, catechizing the bots, right? They're always up to like, well, how do we make sure that AI has the right racial dynamics and the right social attitudes and so forth? But there is this kind of naive assumption, and that poll of Gen Z people really confirms this, I think, that Google is just the blank slate, right? Google, you just feed something into Google and then you get unbiased information, just like the CDC is giving you unbiased guidelines, apolitical guidelines. So Google is kind of spitting out via the clean purity of the algorithm just what it is. And that's why this World Economic Forum quote is so revealing to me. We talked a while back about about Wikipedia, right? And this was the same thing. It was that there were in fact people, and people used to do this when I was in grad school. They would go on for political reasons and spam Wikipedia with edits. That we need more women in this area.
Right.
We need more representation for certain races and sexualities and genders in this area. And so we know that Wikipedia is not unbiased, and yet we still use it. I still use it as kind of your repository for just facts, and how much more so Google, right? Which is even more kind of supposedly this like empty box or this black box out of which the truth comes. And I just did a little, performed an experiment to confirm this claim that we own the science. I typed climate change into Google. And what I noticed is that usually when you do this now, Google will give you a little box. If you just Google a sort of a baseline term or a person or a book, they'll give you a little box with kind of information culled from around the internet. Yeah. A few select sources. Wikipedia is one of them. And one thing that this interaction between the UN and Google seems to have produced is that box on climate change is by the UN. It's from UN Act Now. And so things you can do: save energy at home, walk, bike, or take public transport, eat more vegetables, which is such a sinister way of phrasing what they mean there, because what they actually mean is eat less meat, right? Don't produce all your nasty greenhouse gases by trying to get jacked. Just eat apples. And then you've got the first site that comes up for me is NASA's home for climate change, and then you get UN.org. What is climate change? Mm-hmm. So you're unlikely, I think, to get like a Michael Schellenberger level skepticism about the apocalyptic claims of climate alarmists. Right. It sort of exists to install climate alarmism in some ways as the baseline, just the neutral thing that we can all agree on and then debate from there, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. And this just came to mind. Let me try this out, see what you think. Yeah, in a way, I mean, the whole enterprise of modern education, it seems to me, not just on a question like climate change, but on gender ideology, on race relations, on quote unquote systemic racism, sort of the more hot button stuff, especially history, literature. I mean, a great theme of yours on young heretics. In a way, I mean, I think the modern sort of leftist West regards pretty much all of the Western canon as a species of misinformation, right? It's infused with bias, disproportionately written by, white males, white cis het males. And so it's kind of all suspect. So this is just, we just did a recent, my colleague Scott Yenner and I did a recent report we called Grooming Future Revolutionaries, about the woke indoctrination on America's K through 12 schools on military bases, and how DEI, especially since 2019, has infiltrated K through 12 curriculum. And we got a bunch of videos from this education conference from last year that the Department of Defense Education Activity, the DODA, had sponsored. And it's, the normal stuff, the toxic brew of gender ideology and sharing your pronouns with your teachers. Teachers encouraging everyone to share their pronouns to discuss their sexual identity, and then at the same time teaching about whiteness and white guilt and the systemic racism and all that stuff. Anyway, so really all of modern education, at least modern education, especially disproportionately modern education run by the state through the K through 12 system, and then infected by the state and by the ideology of the last century in higher ed, et cetera. It's all just varying levels, some more pernicious than others, of kind of revolutionary ideological indoctrination. And so it's grooming all the way down, Spencer. Ideological grooming, at least, all the way down.
Another good title for this episode. But no, I mean, I like this sort of theory very much. I think, I want to get into that report that you guys put out in a bit when we start to talk about some of this so-called trans kid stuff, which, as Chris Rufo reminds us, is really, kid castration stuff, and we should kind of shift our language around that accordingly. But you had a City Journal piece about this lately that I'd like to get into. But before we do, just to respond to some of your kind of young hereticsy points here, there was a thing, I think Trump tweeted it at one point, and it's become part of our new kind of meme toolkit, that we want education, not indoctrination, in our schools, and especially in our public schools. what, you know, I get that. I think if that's the line we're going to go with as a slogan, that's, you know, no bumper sticker is perfect. But people have been pointing out, but myself included, that, like, you know, all education is sort of indoctrination in a certain way. If you look at it in this sense that there's no such thing as neutral education, and the accusation against the Western canon that it is somehow biased, right, and that it has inherent kind of, you know, unexamined prejudices inherent in it. That accusation's not wrong. It just leaves two important things out. One, the biases aren't racial and they're not sexual. They have to do with biases toward, you know, certain forms of truth, the truth that is eternal, truth that endures, right? And also, of course, it's the premise is that what we can do is we can clear that bias away and get to this kind of, you know, Shangri-La of neutral purity where, you know, everybody is, all voices are heard. And of course, that's not, as you eloquently argued just now, Ryan, that's not what's going on at all. We're replacing one set of biases with another. And the ancients knew this. I mean, public education is a means of state control. It was conceived that way in Prussia, in modernity. It was thought of that way in classical philosophy by Aristotle and Plato. We shouldn't, I think, be, you know, we should be frank about this. Like the point of investing the state in teaching kids is that our children is the future, right? Like they are the resources that will shape the state going forward. And so we have a public interest in, you know, how their impressionable minds will be molded and shaped. And therefore, when people like DeSantis and Rufo and everybody else, you know, raises these alarm bells, they're absolutely right to. And we have a right to be concerned about, not that there would be some set of values taught in schools. There's always going to be, right? To disagree with that is to do another version of the neutrality fallacy. But values that we teach in schools ought to be affirming of the truth. They ought to be affirming of human nature, of the best that has been thought and said about human nature, because the alternative is just this kind of anti-human distorting, let's call it anti-human distortion field, right? I mean, you put it really well in this City Journal piece, which let us now turn to. This is indoctrinating the military's kids. It's a write-up of the report that you just mentioned, you know, on 160 schools worldwide on American military bases, K through 12 schools.
About 70,000 students, yeah.
Yeah. And the first sentence of this piece I really like. Gender studies aims to upset a stable sexual identity. This is not like, because our typical framing here is that they're just talking too much about the sorts of things that some people might experience, such as gender dysphoria. But that's not actually true. I mean, the best evidence we have suggests that, in fact, they're creating gender dysphoria. It's sort of, you know, by offering frameworks like the gender snow person that thwart and frustrate the kind of natural inclinations of children to sort themselves into categories, not just gendered categories, but to recognize shapes and colors and to understand that, like, there's boys and girls. And what we're really dealing with here is an attempt to kind of clear that away and impose totally new and radically, I think, anti-human vision of how the world works.
Yeah, it's the right. Just to pick up on your neutral education riff. Yeah, I mean, any responsible society will recognize that education, of course, shapes your future citizens. It must. And so there will always be a civic aspect to it. It cannot be, especially from a young age, and Aristotle and Plato would have agreed with this, I think, especially from a young age, it cannot just be, you know, a kind of endless seminar dedicated to finding what is right. That is to say, a kind of endless philosophic questioning and interrogation of the world. Education has to be a bit more practical at certain levels if you're going to have a functioning society. But that doesn't mean that, you know, for a long time in America, at least until the Civil War and then vestiges of it after that, you know, public education was, as it had been in the West for a long time, took its orientation from the notion that there were truths, both divine and natural, that could be found out and discovered by man and ought to be guides for human life, et cetera. And part of education, especially from a young age, was nurturing the wonder about those truths and then some, you know, responsible interrogation of those and sort of learning the facts of life and learning about ethics and government and all the rest. So whereas the postmodern left has now for at least half a century, if not really longer, regards, there's no such thing as truth, really. Reason is not really a thing. I mean, all words, narratives, all of this is about power. And so that's what education has to be about, is about power. Now, it goes under the guises in gender ideology or sort of anti-racist teachings or CRT. It goes under the guise of, well, we're just teaching kids to be tolerant of others, even if, they have two mommies, or they might not identify as a girl in some binary way, or they're confused about or uncomfortable in their body. And then on the racism side, it's well, we're just teaching about the history of racism. And these are really smoke screens for what's going on, which is at root, the philosophy behind it says that there is no truth, that language and human sociability in general and working together in political communities, it's all about power because there is no truth. So we need to get our people in and teach kids at a very young age that they ought to understand the world in terms of the complete malleability of both sexuality, well, not of both, of sexuality and gender. And then also we need to overturn the past power structure, which on our own terms, we can't really say was bad because we don't believe in good and bad. But nonetheless, we're going to assert was bad and oppressive and sort of overturn it and put the formerly oppressed on top and the former oppressors on the bottom. That's what's going on. To tie in Chris Rufo, just preempt you a little bit, I just loved his phrase, and it's a good time to introduce it for the gender ideology stuff. We called our report Grooming Future Revolutionaries, and we used grooming in a broad sense of both ideological and otherwise. But Chris's nice phrase is the gender ideology to gender clinic pipeline. And that gets at the kind of anti-human or transhuman monstrosity at the heart of at least the gender ideology stuff, which you mentioned.
Yeah, to a footnote, I think, to that kind of neat little précis of nihilism, postmodernism, and power politics, which is another connection that ancient observers have already saw. Right? I mean, this was kind of the great crisis of the Athenian conscience, was the sort of Thrasymacheian void and the sophistical turn, which ends you up massacring the men of Milos. But that's perhaps a story for another day, except to say that also from antiquity and throughout the history of really honest, bare bones philosophers, there has been a kind of you can see that there are varying levels of self-awareness to moral relativism. And you have all the way down to like Heraclitus and Cratylus, right? Cratylus, who ultimately ends up only moving a single finger because he recognizes that all motion and action is impossible, right? Up to the kind of dumbstruck observers in Nietzsche's Public Square who watch the madman scream that God is dead and don't understand that he's talking about them, that they're already living, they're already saying things that ultimately, if worked out to their implications, will destroy the moral foundations of their entire society. But they're just acting as if they can kind of go along and keep those foundations intact while also attacking, the ideological basis for them. And I think we're dealing with that too, also in our public square right now. We have people always ask, like, stupid or evil, right? Are we looking at a coordinated effort to sort of pour acid onto the psyches and to the moral foundations of American society, or are we just looking at people that have gotten so fat and happy that they don't understand these things need upkeep? And the answer is, I think, a little bit of both, right? You have a lot of obliviousness to ideas that are actually nuclear reactors that you can't just play with for fun. And then you have people that know very much the power of those ideas and are aiming them squarely at to punish their political enemies. But speaking of politics, I'm trying to get back here to this Rufo thing that you mentioned. This is really important. This is really Rufo's, in my opinion, like great genius, is political framing, messaging, right? He's obviously a great reporter as well, and he's always digging up, he's just going and making these requests, FOIA requests and so forth, to discover the sorts of things that you discover in this report about the military schools, right? But at the same time, what he really knows how to do is then take all of that data and synthesize it into an accurate but politically viable reframing of the rhetoric, because the left's really good at this. The left's good at gender. It's gender therapy. It's gender affirming care that's being banned in Tennessee and Texas and these meanies, Greg Abbott and And Ron DeSantis, they want to tell you not to say gay. They want to tell you that children can't get the life-affirming care that they need, by which they imply, right, that if you don't chop off a child's genitals, then they'll commit suicide, right? This whole kind of, abortion is another area where this happens, kind of euphemism and smoke screens have to exist in order to distract attention away from the kind of brute physical realities of what's going on.
Yeah.
And so here's Chris, here's his thread. The left has made a strategic mistake in calling for the DOJ to prosecute journalists who oppose radical gender surgeries for minors. Conservatives should frame this as government suppression and focus the debates on the facts and images, which are horrific, and make a 70-30 issue. He cites the New York Times' poll that 70% of the public opposes teaching gender theory in elementary school. I think there's different contexts in which some of these things might just be too horrifying to speak about in polite company, but there are certain cases in which he must be absolutely right? I want to see every conservative news program play the videos, show the photos, reference the studies, and quote the queer theorist. He's got a cool little, I found this radical gender theory guide, a parent's guide to radical gender theory on his website, which is really good about this too. But you are in fact talking about taking confused children, or in some cases children who just want to be cool, right? Who want to kind of conform with what their peers are doing, and performing really, as Abigail Shrier says, causing irreversible damage. The double mastectomies, these hormone treatments are not reversible either, and lead to all sorts of complications regarding bone density. And in women, you change a young girl's voice, she's never going to get that back. And detransitioners are starting to speak up about this too in a really tragic and horrifying way. And as I understand him, correct me, Ryan, if you think I'm wrong, Rufo is basically saying this is where we want the attention. Just as in the midterms, we want the attention on crime and on the economy, and not on, say, abortion gaffes or whatever. This is where we want the attention in this arena. We want it on the practical realities of what's going on. In your view, I mean, I've seen some movement on this. I've seen, here in Tennessee, Matt Walsh has done this really kind of shocking investigation of Vanderbilt, and he's gotten some Republican legislators on board with trying to outlaw some of this stuff. Some of it already has been, the thing where boys play on girls' sports teams, that's been outlawed. But in your view, is this something that Republican politicians are actually catching wise on? I mean, it seems like such a slam dunk, but of course, that's no guarantee with the Republican Party that they're actually going to make the shot.
Yeah, some are getting wise to it. Our colleague Scott Yenner has had some success in Idaho, his home state. His day job's at Boise State University, and they got the legislature to defund to the tune of a few $1 million. So this was a couple years ago now, or a year and a half ago. Some of this stuff, some of the DEI stuff at colleges, that's a far cry from teaching gender ideology in schools. No, I mean, the big contest is going to be between normal Republicans, especially, I think, at the state level in various size states, running up against the donor class and corporate class of right-wing donors. This is what played out in Arkansas with Asa Hutchinson. I mean, Arkansas in many ways is kind of a fiefdom of the Walton family. And, a lot, and you saw also some of the stuff with the vacillations from Kristi Noem. What state did she run? South Dakota?
South Dakota, yes.
Yeah. On the trans girls in sports and stuff. I mean, a lot of these business interests are very much bought into the kind of official national political line, which is now the official line at HR departments. At most international or large U.S. corporations, it's the line at all the prestigious universities, which is to say the normal left-wing line on all of this, which is that, unless you offer gender affirming care as soon as children want it, and one of the teachers in the presentations we had from military schools said as young as 4 is when gender identity is forming and becoming stable. So that's when you should start talking about this stuff. If you don't offer support and quote unquote gender affirming care, which is, as you said, often a euphemism for the beginning stages of sterilization through puberty blockers, and then a stepping stone to mutilating surgeries, permanently removing body parts gendered body parts. unless you do all this, you're going to have a bunch of dead kids on your hand because they have bad mental health, et cetera, et cetera. Leaving aside the fact completely that there doesn't really seem to be any evidence of that yet. And I would actually submit, even if there were evidence of that, the solution wouldn't be to mutilate people and block their hormones. But anyway, this is how the fight's playing out. So it will take, I think, many years now before, well, we'll see how this clash plays out, and we'll see how the business community and how the kind of Chamber of Commerce type donor community on the right responds to this type of thing. So a lot of this will have to be led, I think, culturally and politically from the bottom up, and we're seeing this too, by the revolt of the moms at school board meetings and running for local office, running for local school board and all this stuff. And then the top down thing to solve is both at the state level, I think, there are lots of creative ways to come at this. And then also at the national legislative level or regulatory level, is you really must dismantle, figuratively burn to the ground and salt the earth all of the education schools in the country. These are, for those not acquainted with this, an Ed.D., that is a doctorate in education, and then a master's in education. Master's especially is like the credential to put you at the top of the compensation structure in public schooling in America. That's how it's that plus seniority. So it's the M in education, the master's in education, plus how long you've been at a public school in most states elevates, puts you on track to make the most money you can as a public educator. And really, without exception, all of those education schools were created in a way by the left, by progressivism, not originally to teach this kind of stuff. They predate that sort of thing, but they're now the credential for pedagogy, official sanctioned, healthy, quote unquote, pedagogy from higher education on down as far as modern progressivism sees it. And progressivism, while it had different goals, sort of values, I would say at its inception when it was thinking of this kind of professionalization of education, it nonetheless put the apparatus in place, that is the professional schools and then all the bureaucracies sort of insulated from political control. And as the ideology has evolved to take up anti-racism, quote unquote anti-racism, CRT, and gender ideology, all that infrastructure has just, it didn't even need to adapt. It was just repurposed to push the latest radical ideology, which is not nearly as old as progressivism, but is what's driving a lot of this. You could say it has its roots in kind of the post-war leftist, 60s, 70s, take your pick, postmodernism, various strands of postmodernism. So the whole thing is, it's a huge thing to take on. But I think we have to try to take it on at every level we can, because if you let this keep going, you will destroy civilization. You'll destroy Western civilization, and you'll certainly change the American way of life indelibly. And you'll have to an already weakened, crumbling, and decrepit constitutional order will be finally vanquished.
Yeah, I posted about this long ago. One of my first pieces for the site was about this guy Aristodemus of Cumae in antiquity, who, here's a real deep cut for you, but it's actually profoundly opposite to what you were just saying, Ryan. This guy was a tyrant. He took over Cumae, and one of his measures to ensure that there would be no uprisings was to feminize the boys. And he did it by putting certain teachers in schools who would treat them effectively as girls, who would trans them early on. But I think your point, Ryan, is so important about this thing being driven by parents from the ground up, right? I mean, holding politicians' feet to the fire, refusing to support politicians that are not robust and clear about this, because it really is a winning. I mean, it is not the sort of thing to be afraid about, as Chris says. DeSantis is the model here. You put your foot down, then everybody yells at you and calls you a terrorist and a fascist and a child killer, and then you just don't move, and people come around. This is not a winning issue for the left. Decent, regular people look at what's going on here. If it's presented to them clearly and are horrified, as well they should be, because it is something out of like some nightmare butcher shop in a horror show, you know. And it, you look, I mean, Democrats are already, I think, on the back foot when it comes to non-white voters, as they might say. The gains that Trump got among Latinos are not going away. This is a crucial area in which people that just generally kind of, you know, it's an incredibly rarefied, elite, wealthy view of the world that can even begin to countenance the abstractions entailed in gender theory. Those people ain't, you know, Latino communities ain't really having it a lot of the time. I mean, obviously, every group sends people to the academy to become members of our sort of insane, rarefied ruling class. But speaking very broadly, right, like, you know, these are gains that conservatives, Republicans very much can make if you stick to your guns and if you hold your politicians' feet to the fire. I mean, there is another, I think, from that side of things, there is another obstacle besides the moneyed interests and politicians caving, and that is just, you know, the kind of bluntness that Chris is advising here, which in some ways I think recalls the bluntness of the early pro-life movement, especially, right? These images showing people what's actually going on before you could hear even the heartbeat, you know. Is that another piece I wrote for the site a while back was called Children and Transgenderism. And it begins with just a description in as clinical terms as possible of what goes on in various forms of so-called sex change intervention. And I have to say that it was like tearing my eyes out to look at this stuff or to write it. You know, it's like you do feel, I mentioned earlier, a kind of reticence about talking about these sorts of things in polite company because it's so grotesque. And conservatives, I think, generally don't like to talk about grotesque things in polite company. We tend to, I think, veer toward decorum, and certainly we're not comfortable with the forms of extravagant, you know, open public sexuality that the left can be very happy to push. And so I think that there's some, you know, nice moms and dads out there who, in addition to not wanting to be called fascist, bigot, homophobe pigs or whatever, are also just feeling like, you know, do I really have to talk about and look at these disgusting things? And the answer is, you know, actually yes, you know, because otherwise these things is coming to you. I mean, this is like the Babylon Bee had a headline, something to the effect of like California stations snipers to perform abortions across state lines. And the same is true, mutatis mutandis, about this gender stuff in California. That Gavin Newsom is effectively trying to make it legal in California for the state to take kids away from parents if they resist their children's, you know, trans inclinations or what have you.
Yeah, including court orders that would reach across state lines.
Exactly.
And you know, say you have divorced parents and the custodial parent or majority custodial or part-time or whatever, who lives in some other state, if that parent and that child come together into the state again, and there's an order, you know, that child could be taken from that parent and, I don't know, forced to undergo gender affirming care. That might be a bridge too far, but coaxed into it. You know, it's actually a lot of this is it recalls, you know, in the 90s it was kind of big news. A lot of these horror stories of child protective services, you know, and psychologists taking young children especially and kind of planting, you know, recalled memories that actually didn't really happen of child abuse and molestation in impressionable young kids, and using that as the pretense to tear apart families and put kids in the system and take them from their parents. And there is tons of horror stories about CPS, and there still are. And this will be another fertile ground for this kind of conflict between the state and parents. It's bad. I mean, it's why, you know, I hate to say it. I love a good fight as much as the next guy, but I think it's the rational decision for traditionally minded, religious, and or just sane, natural law, natural rights loving parents, or non-leftist ideologically committed parents, I mean, you just have to get out of these states if you have kids in them. That's certainly my plan. And, the outliers are few and definable. And then there are a bunch in the middle. And then there's some that are even more sane. So it's the calculation now that is driving, I think, a lot of we've talked a lot about the great migration in the US, the great resort being driven by COVID, but it's also being driven by political ideology, and people kind of scoff at the idea, I think, or many do, that you would move just because your neighbors are Democrats. And no, it's not that. It's this kind of thing that your very left-wing state, like in a place like California, New York, or Massachusetts, is just much more inclined to and better equipped legally and regulatorily to really wreak havoc on your family life in a way that takes out of your control the raising and education of your children.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and it bears repeating, I think, just to close out on this admittedly rather gruesome topic. It bears repeating. We've said this in other contexts, that this moral high ground that our opponents in this debate want to claim is just farcical and fallacious in the extreme. And there's simply no reason to be cowed by it for a moment. I mean, we all at this point laugh at the homophobe, bigot, all the accusations that they throw at you because they're so manifestly absurd. But we still get a little catch in our chest when someone piles on online or says nasty things about us. And this is an area, as you pointed out, Ryan, where even the ostensible backup to those accusations is completely fabricated. This idea that you're causing children to commit suicide by suggesting that they shouldn't allow doctors to cut their genitals off. There's no reason, no circumstance, even if you accept the view that there is such a thing as trans from early on or whatever, which I don't really myself accept. And even if you accept the view, which I do accept, that adult people who experience persistent gender dysphoria, have a range of things that we might do to try to accommodate them and try in a decent society to try to figure out a way to alleviate that pain. Even if you accept all of those arguments, there are zero situations in which it's right or appropriate or morally virtuous to interfere with the healthy operating biological systems of a child, especially in ways that pertain to sex and sexual identity. So with that, I think having been as clear as possible about that, fight the good fight in the confidence that we're not only right here, we have the moral high ground, and it's not a competition. Okay, let us turn to one last item here, maybe somewhat quickly, and that's this OPEC plus decision to reduce oil production. I always think OPEC plus. It's like, is that like Disney Plus? Am I going to get like what do I get thrown in here? What
get extra oil? Yeah.
It turns out the old classics you get are things like Austria, Mexico, Norway, Oman, and Russia, plus the OPEC plus countries, which are ones that are not in this officially, I guess, in this organization, but participate and voluntarily in their initiatives: Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Brunei. So this is one of these, international organizations, and they're gathered together to debate and discuss how they're going to manage their oil production. As of September 2018, I'm reading from good old Wikipedia here, the 13 member countries accounted for an estimated 44% of global oil production. So OPEC Plus met, and they decided in the face of any number of things. We can get into what it was in the face of: dropping prices, perhaps, and international events regarding Russia and Ukraine, that they're going to cut production by 2 million barrels per day. This is likely to drive prices back up, basically everywhere. We had a slight, relaxation in oil prices, although it still hasn't returned to pre-Biden levels here, but can expect that this will drive prices up significantly, and that this will in particular be rough times in Europe, where energy costs and gas costs were already likely to skyrocket throughout the continent. Look, the issue here is energy independence, and the decision on Biden's part to revoke the permit of the Keystone pipeline is just looking more and more like a catastrophic self-own here. This was something he did very early on upon taking office, and he is now calling, right, on administration and Congress to explore ways to boost U.S. energy production. It's like, how could we get more independent from these nations in OPEC? Like, what would that look like? Meanwhile, Biden, in part, I think, to alleviate the cost of gas and therefore boost his own public perception, has been spending down, draining away our strategic oil reserves. We're at something like a 40-year low now, even down from, at our peak, just under 750 million barrels of strategic petroleum reserve. Now looks like down to about 350 million, and only dropping yet more precipitously, which we've been doing in order to kind of keep these prices down. If we want to keep doing that, we're going to have to do it yet more. And one thing about oil that you may or may not know is it is a finite resource. And if you have X amount of it in the tank and then you spend X amount, then you have zero amount. So this is really, I mean, truly a clown car from the Biden administration, this gesturing about, oh, we need more oil. He's infamous for having put a sudden and seemingly inexplicable, unless via reference to climate alarmism, an inexplicable cap or stop on a lot of these drilling permits in the U.S. And the cancellation of the Keystone pipeline is really the one that everybody's talking about right now. Ryan, do you think there's any chance of a reversal of that here? Or, I mean, what can they even? I don't actually know how these sorts of things work. It would seem like it's too little too late at this point from Biden, no?
Yeah, I think it's just mostly a bunch of rhetoric. You must be seen to be doing something. So a bunch of hand waving at Congress and directives to the regulatory apparatus to help with this, I guess. It's just, I mean, it's mostly symbolic. No, it's just part of the, I don't know what to call it, just insanity of modern left energy policy. And it's not all of the left, right? There's like a burgeoning movement of dissident environmentalists on the left or center left, like Michael Schellenberger and others. Some of Steve Hayward's friends, I forget the institute they run up there in Berkeley, and they're all environmentalists and of various stripes, and they say, energy is important, wind and solar, et cetera, is not scalable for the foreseeable future, probably forever. Also, to make it really scalable, you'd have to have tons and tons of battery production, which, to make a battery involves all sorts of pretty, environmentally harmful mining operations, including mining zinc and other things. So, it's just, we've talked about this before. It's just another version of the left thinking if you speak it into being, it will be. And that seems to be where they are on energy policy. And the only reason they're complaining at all right now is because they're facing an election in 22 and then one in 24. So, they need to be seen to be doing something. And to the extent that they can take credit for, quote unquote, doing something, they will. So, but they're really in a bind. I mean, their lefty environmentalist base says, really we need to get off fossil fuels like yesterday. And that is just impossible if you look at energy demands across the world. And also, even if we completely stopped our reliance on fossil fuels and went totally fossil fuel, zero.
Carbon zero or whatever.
Carbon zero in the U.S., 100 years from now, global temperatures would have been reduced by 0.2 degrees or something. Right. Because the big thing is the rest of the world, especially the global south and Asia. So it's China, it's India, it's Africa, which is growing like crazy population-wise. Will be 3 billion people in 50 years or 40 years, whatever it is. Don't quote me, but Africa's growing like crazy. And, developing countries want cheap energy because that's how you get rich and how you become a non-developing country anymore. So just the complete disjunction between reality and facts and intentions. It's sort of leftism at its most extravagant, except for maybe the worst of the excesses of mid-century communism, either in Russia or in Mao's China. But it's just there's a gap that is as wide as the Grand Canyon between reality and expectation. And at least for now, most of the politicians on the left are just happy to either lie about it or change the subject. And we'll see how long this really really can go on, especially as we continue to face quarter over quarter inflation and high energy prices. So, at a certain point, electoral disaster, you would think, would chasten some of these plans. But I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I think in a in a normal America or a healthier republic, the fruits of left-wing policy of late, both foreign and domestic, and coupled with the kind of crazy leading edge ideological fads of in education policy and quote unquote, healthcare with the gender stuff and everything else, you'd think that the midterms would be a wipeout by the party that opposes all that, like hands down. But it doesn't really appear that way. I mean, granted, the GOP was starting at a higher baseline than they had in past midterms, and so you shouldn't expect a 70-seat blowout, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, it should be a shoo-in in 2022. And yet, for all sorts of, I think, cross-current reasons, political and ideological, and let alone the kind of 24/7 and still very influential media machine, which is mostly on the side of one party, you have a midterm election that seems much closer than it should be.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a combination, right, of that, leftist control of media with Republican incompetence, and
that's right.
A lot of rake
the
stepping.
The stupid party continues to be stupid in various ways. And
sure do. Yeah, exactly. It's their favorite thing to do.
As I used to say of Mitt Romney, he politically speaking, like he couldn't smell blood in the water if he was like in the middle of decomposing chum carcass, or 1,000, people know what I'm talking about. But yeah, we have. Some of our politicians are good and know how to capitalize and make political hay while the sun shines. DeSantis being probably the most prominent national example, and Trump in various ways before him. But yeah, a lot of the party on the right fails to capitalize on easily capitalizable facts.
Yeah, this environment stuff. I mean, here's another area that's ripe for realignment. And even though we constantly talk about realignment and we talk about all the shifting sands of political designations, and you alluded to the fact that left and right doesn't really cover the divide here. For all of that, we could be making a lot more hay out of this sort of thing, especially now that it has these concrete implications, right? That this truly absurd and self-referential idea that like every storm ever is proof that not only is climate change real, but we need to be therefore like cutting every don't even move, just sit at home wrapped in a blanket, wrapped in a warm blanket, don't eat any meat, don't do anything. This is so insane. And there are, as you pointed out, there are people like Steve Hayward and Jeremy Carl and Michael Schellenberger, who have many actionable plans to resolve this and other concerns, nuclear energy, right? And this kind of Malthusianism that has predominated falsely in the face of every falsification, this idea that there are limits to our production, that we can't get wealthier, that we can't grow, that we can't sustainably continue to use the Earth's resources is just false. There are ways, in fact, for us to develop our economy and our technology without, pillaging the Earth, which should be a concern. I mean, we're running a feature about this at the American Mind right now, precisely because, as Steve Hayward reminds us in the Slug, the opener of the feature, this has long been a conservative, or used to be a more conservative issue, to not cede environmentalism to the environmentalists and the crazies and the apocalyptists, right? Roger Scruton famously points out that conservation and conservatism are from obviously similar roots.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should all care about the planet.
No rational person should want to despoil the earth in pursuit of profit. That's the caricature of the right, by the left.
Yeah, and leave it as a sort of decaying husk as we jet off to Mars or whatever. Like nobody wants that. It's just that the thing, for the very reason that it's so important, we ought to be taking measures to fix what problems we do create, to fix them in a sustainable and meaningful way, rather than a kind of crazy and theological way. Theological in the most disparaging sense of that term, of course, rather than its actual meaning. One little fillip that I wanted to mention based on our last conversation, I don't know if you saw this, Ryan, but we were talking about the Nord Stream pipeline last week and the what seems obviously to be explosions that have caused leaks in them.
Right.
And we were talking about, well, this is something perhaps Russia could have done as a form of self-sabotage, sort of false flag to gain support or to blame it on the West. But then it is something that perhaps, Biden and Victoria Nuland were talking about, not letting this pipeline continue. Jeffrey Sachs, who's a Columbia professor.
Yeah, I watched that interview.
Did you see this? Yeah, he just basically was like, I don't even think he thought it was going to be controversial. He's like, I'm pretty sure that the U.S. blew this pipeline up. And of course, the interviewer went insane. What was he on? He was he's talking to Bloomberg.
On Bloomberg, yeah.
Yeah. And they booted him off basically, but he didn't even think this was going to be controversial, at least as one of the possible options or explanations. So that's sort of an interesting data point here too.
Yeah, Jeffrey Sachs from Vienna, and he say, his point, and his core point was a good one, which is like, basically, he didn't quite put it this way, but he's like, basically, you people are in a bubble. I mean, I consume a lot of foreign media, and like most of the rest of the world outside of Western Europe and the U.S., it's like coin flip for them on who did this, and they're just terrified of us, of sort of the NATO hawks, the Ukraine stands, and the U.S. Stepping us closer and closer to a nuclear conflict, in Eastern Europe, and he said, guilty as charged. I want peace. So there's an interesting crossing of old wires here between a kind of a contingent of the old kind of nuclear freeze left, the kind of political and academic nuclear freeze left, and the kind of new right who considers NATO's sort of the heedless expansion of NATO since the 90s is probably a mistake, and our miscalculations with Russia, its self-perception, and what it sees as a threat and what it doesn't, as of a piece with just sort of bungling foreign policy, bipartisan bungling foreign policy. So anyway, there's the convergence of old political enemies uniting around the kind of, at the very least, objecting to what seems to be a pretty reckless source of conduct, and especially rhetoric from a good portion of the Western Europe, NATO countries, and the U.S. on this Ukraine question and the war.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that comparative sobriety of European news outlets. I mean, maybe this is a grass is greener thing, but maybe it's just because Europe, as we said last week, is kind of up against the hard-edged realities of our various blunders and bumblings more than we are. We're sort of insulated. We've always been insulated from the world in some sense by the ocean. But another example of this, also related to something we talked about last week, is the Giorgia Meloni election. Matteo Renzi, who's one of Meloni's biggest detractors and opponents, he goes on in an interview. He says, she is my opponent. I will always oppose her. But this fascism, this is fake news. It's fake news. I mean, it's really great to hear an Italian use that phrase. But this is the nonsense idea, and to hear even Renzi shoot it down is sort of sobering. When you compare it to our news media.
Yeah, the good news about Italian politics, at least for Meloni's coalitional prospects, I mean, Italy is notoriously volatile. I forget who, someone reminded me of this at some recent podcast or something, that in the post-war period, we've had, I think, 14 presidents in the U.S. I think Great Britain's had 17 prime ministers, and Italy has had 40 or something, or 42, or I forget. So it is a volatile sort of coalitional place with shifting. I mean, the prime example is Meloni, who founded her party, the Brothers of Italy, 3 years ago?
Totally.
So, but the one thing in her favor is, Italians of all political stripes, I think, will quickly recall their last kind of sovereign debt argument with the EU, and the EU basically is telling them that they've got to take it good and hard and like it. And now with the Meloni government, you have all the normal, Christine Lagarde and the IMF people all saying, well, we'll see how this is a couple weeks ago, we'll see how the Italian election goes. But if it goes badly, we have tools to, make it better. So the continuing struggle between populists and nationalists on the one hand, and the kind of arrogant pretensions of pan-Europeanism on the other will continue to boil over. And Italy's just the latest example. The one wonderful thing about Italy is that you have a kind of chain-smoking, fiery, 45-year-old, attractive Giorgia Meloni the first female prime minister of Italy, right? So very interesting.
Stunning and brave.
Interesting
Strong
developments.
woman. Yeah. Well, Ryan, you have no chance to survive. Make your time. We are out of time is the rough translation of this Kat's statement. Always when we go one-on-one, I always think like, oh, are we gonna have enough to talk about? And then of course it's the opposite problem. Like we're gonna go over because we have so much to say to one another.
These buffoons have been rambling forever.
That's yeah, exactly. And we'll continue to do so off mic. Yeah. So for the rest of you, I'm afraid we have to bid you adieu and see you next week. Thank you for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at AmericanMind.org, Claremont.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. I'm going to flag one more time the article Indoctrinating the Military's Kids, the latest in a series of articles about this report on the U.S. military and their K-12 schools from Ryan and Scott Yenner. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. And don't forget to rate us. Give us 5 stars or nothing. It's 5 stars or nothing. Keep your mouth shut or give us 5 stars. Those are your options. But please, I kid, but please do give us 5 stars. It really helps people find the show. You can share. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to you all. Talk to you next week.